Hi, today we're going to talk about the digestive system. Food contains a variety of nutrients, and these molecules are needed to build new body tissues, repairing damaged tissues, and sustaining our chemical reactions. First of all, the food must be broken down into molecules small enough to cross the plasma membrane of our cells. This breakdown process is known as digestion. The passage of these molecules into the blood and the lymph is called absorption. About the digestive system, it includes a continuous tube that begins at the mouth and ends at the anus. So let's go over an overview of how this process works. Let's pretend we're going to eat an apple. So we're going to take a bite of the apple, and first of all, we're going to put it in our mouth, and we're going to begin by chewing it. So in the mouth, we're going to begin mechanical digestion by breaking it down. The salivary glands are going to moisten and lubricate this apple and begin some starch digestion of it. And then this is going to go, the tongue is going to push this apple, which is now called a bolus, to the back of our throat, and we're going to swallow it. And it's going to enter the esophagus. The esophagus is primarily a transport tube, and it's sending this bolus of food into the stomach. When it reaches the stomach, it's going to spend some time here, and it's going to be stored here while the stomach churns this bolus and mixes the digestive enzymes, the gastric juice with the bolus to the point where it becomes almost a soupy liquid before it enters into the small intestine. So the small intestine includes three regions. The first part here is called the duodenum. The second part is the jejunum, and the end part here is called the ileum. As you notice, we have some accessory digestive organs. It includes the liver and the gallbladder that are secreting bile into the duodenum, and the pancreas, which secretes pancreatic juice into the duodenum. We'll learn that within the small intestine, most of the absorption of our nutrients occurs, and also most of the digestion occurs in the small intestine. Then this chyme is going to go into the large intestine, which is this region in yellow. And this is where this chyme is being prepared for elimination. So a little bit of absorption is going to occur. Primarily, we're going to absorb water, preparing this chyme and creating what we call feces for elimination. So if we look at the gastrointestinal system, it's also called the alimentary canal. It extends, it's a continuous tube that starts at the mouth and it goes all the way down to the anus. So we're going to discuss these different regions, which includes the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and large intestine. Its length ranges from 15 to 30 feet. The accessory digestive organs begin in the mouth, which include the teeth, the tongue, and the salivary glands. And other secondary accessory digestive organs includes the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas, which is located behind the stomach. So to understand the digestive process, let's go over some terms that we have to learn. So ingestion means the taking of the food into the mouth. Propulsion means the movement of the food. It occurs through swallowing in the throat or in the pharynx. Peristalsis means the autonomic control of contractions and relaxations that occurs throughout our gastrointestinal system, moving this food or this gastric contents along the alimentary canal. We divide it up into separate methods of digestion. Mechanical digestion includes chewing, which starts in the mouth. The churning of the stomach muscles, there's 3 layers of them, so they're mixing the food with the digestive enzymes and the gastric juice. and also mixing by segmentation, which you see through the gastrointestinal system, the contraction and relaxation as it's pushing the food through the alimentary canal. Chemical digestion is caused by the secretion of enzymes. These enzymes are produced through the alimentary canal. Absorption means the method that we're reabsorbing these nutrients into lymph and blood. Defecation is the elimination of undigestible substances and waste matters out of the anus. We call that feces. So when we talk about mechanical digestion, we're going to include the teeth, which grind the food up, the stomach muscles and small intestines that churn the food, mixing the food with the digestive enzymes to initiate further breakdown. Chemical digestion is the way we break down carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids into smaller molecules that can be absorbed. And these digestive enzymes are secreted throughout our gastrointestinal system. So the walls of the GI tract from the esophagus to the anal canal consist of 4 major layers. We're going to talk about these from the innermost to the outermost. So the innermost is called the mucosa. The mucosa surrounds the lumen of the gastrointestinal system. It contains of 3 layers. The inner is the epithelium, which is made up of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It has, you see these little green circles, which are the lymphatics of this region, and that's called the lamina propria, which has the lamina propria mucosal associated lymphoid tissue. And there's a small layer of muscularis mucosa, which is important for the contraction of the smooth muscles and also the folds that exist in this region, which increase the surface area of this lumen for absorption and secretion. So the next layer in is called the submucosa. The submucosa has nerves and blood vessels located in it, and it has the areolar connective tissue. Within this, we have what we discussed in the past as the brain of the gut, or the enteric nervous system is located in this region, which is the autonomic nervous system controlled by our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. As we move further out is the muscularis layer, and in this region we have skeletal muscles controlled voluntarily, and the autonomic, the smooth muscles controlled by our autonomic nervous system. They also contain the mesenteric plexus, which contains it is controlled by the sympathetics and the parasympathetic nervous system. The serosa is this outer layer. The serosa is which binds the GI tract within our abdominal cavity. We're going to talk about this in greater detail. So the peritoneum is a double layer of the serous membrane within the abdominal cavity. So when we study the serous membranes, we've studied in the past that the outer layer is called the parietal layer, and this is a thin layer of epithelium that lines the walls of the abdominal pelvic cavity. The visceral layer is a thin layer of epithelium that adheres and covers the organs within the cavity. And then the space in between the cavity is called a peritoneal cavity, which has a thin layer of serous fluid. So this peritoneum is a series of large folds that exist in this abdominal cavity, which binds the organs to each other and also binds them or adheres them to the abdominal walls. So this explains how we understand that all of these abdominal pelvic organs are not just floating around in there, they're bound by these folds. When we think of the retroperitoneal organs, these are organs that lie up against the posterior abdominal wall. And that includes the ascending and descending colon of the large intestine, the duodenum of the small intestine, and the pancreas. These organs are only covered by the peritoneum anteriorly and not posteriorly. So on this image, we could see the parietal peritoneum, which lines the walls of the abdominal pelvic cavity. The visceral peritoneum is right on the organs themselves, and then the peritoneal cavity is the space in between. So there's 5 major peritoneal folds that we're going to talk about. The first one is the greater omentum, which is of these peritoneal folds, and it's going to lie over the transverse colon of the large intestine. And if we could see it, which I'll show you an image in a minute, it looks like a fatty apron. The importance about this, it contains lymph nodes and macrophages. The next one is called the falciform ligament. The falciform ligament connects the liver to the anterior abdominal wall and the diaphragm. The lesser omentum connects the stomach and the duodenum from the liver. The mesentery is another peritoneal fold that connects the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall, and the mesocolon connects the large intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. So let's look at these in more detail. So first of all, the greater omentum looks like this. It kind of looks like a fatty apron that lies over the transverse colon, and it connects the stomach to the transverse colon of the large intestines. On this image here, this is the J-shaped stomach. You could see the greater omentum connects to the greater curvature of the stomach. The lesser curvature of the stomach connects to the lesser omentum. And what the lesser omentum is this peritoneal, liver that connects the liver to the stomach. Here's the falciform ligament. This is the liver. This is the right lobe. This is the left lobe. The falciform ligament connects the liver to the anterior abdominal wall. The mesocolon connects the large intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. This is the mesocolon. And the mesentery connects the small intestine to the posterior abdominal wall. So let's discuss the alimentary canal. We're going to begin to the mouth. The mouth is known as the buccal cavity. When we go into the mouth, the inside of the mouth, the tissue is made up of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It's very protective of the inner lining of the mouth. Here is the tongue. The tongue is covered with skeletal muscle, so it's under our conscious control. It connects, it's binded to, it's bound in here through a little ligament called the frenulum, the labial frenulum. The tongue pushes the food back to the back of the throat so we could swallow it. We see the teeth here. The teeth initiate mechanical digestion, chewing the food. And back here, you could see this little flap of tissue called the uvula. So the important thing of the uvula is that it closes off the nasopharynx, so it prevents food and liquids from entering the nasal cavity. So within the mouth, we have 3 pairs of major salivary glands, the parotid glands laterally, submandibular and sublingual glands. And most of saliva is 99.5% water and 5% of are solutes. These solutes are slightly acidic, and they secrete salivary amylase, which initiates starch digestion in the mouth. They also secrete lingual lipase, which initiate triglyceride digestion. So then this food is going into the pharynx. So remember, we talked about the nasopharynx, which only has the space for the nasal cavity, where the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx have both bringing in air and food. So the tongue is going to push this bolus of food back into the oropharynx, and we're going to swallow this, and that's called deglutition. And that's the method of this food going from the laryngopharynx into the esophagus. So you can see here, remember we talked in the past about this little flap called the epiglottis. So when we swallow, the epiglottis is going to close off the trachea, preventing food from going into the trachea. At the same time with swallowing, the uvula is going to close off the nasopharynx, preventing food from going up into that region. So from the laryngopharynx, the food is going to enter into the esophagus, which takes the food into the stomach. So here is an image of the esophagus. The esophagus is primarily only a passageway of food from mouth to stomach. So with the esophagus, there's an upper esophageal sphincter, which is going to regulate the food going from the laryngopharynx into the esophagus. And the way this food, which now is called a bolus, is going to travel down the esophagus, that's through the process called peristalsis, which is a progression of involuntary contractions and relaxations of the esophagus as it's propelling this bolus of food into the stomach. The mucus glands of the esophagus are going to lubricate this bolus to further reduce the friction and allow it to pass through into the stomach. At this end, we have another sphincter called the lower esophageal sphincter that relaxes during swallowing, allowing this bolus of food to pass into the stomach. So the lower esophageal sphincter, as you see, the bolus is in green. Through peristalsis, it's bringing this bolus. The lower esophageal sphincter, or the little door, is going to open up, allowing the bolus to enter into the stomach. This is a section of the esophagus. You could see the layers, the mucosal layer, the submucosal layer, and then the muscularis layer of the esophagus. So then the food enters the stomach. In the stomach, there are four main regions. So the first region here is called the fundus of the stomach, or a holding area. Then you could see the body, or the cardia. Then the next region that we could see here is the body of the stomach, and this region here, which connects to the small intestine, is called the pylorus. So if we look at the stomach here, you could also see three layers of smooth muscle. There's a longitudinal layer, a circular layer, and an oblique layer. So the function of these layers of smooth muscle is the contraction and relaxation, or the mixing and churning of this bolus with the gastric juice and the digestive enzymes to further break down this bolus. So on this end, we have the pyloric atrium, pyloric canal, and then at the end is the pyloric sphincter. So the pyloric sphincter is the end of the stomach before it connects to the small intestine, and this first part of the small intestine is called the duodenum. If we could look at a stomach, this is a cadaver, you can see these ridges, and they are called rugae of the mucosa, and they could be seen with the naked eye. They have a couple of functions. They kind of connect to what's in the stomach to assist in the churning and moving around as a mixing of the bolus with the digestive enzymes and the gastric juice. And the other important function is when the stomach is full, it gives the stomach a greater capacity to stretch out as we fill the stomach, and when it's empty, it's going to fold up into these folds called rugae. If we look at this top curvature is called the lesser curvature. And remember, it connects to the lesser omentum of the stomach that connects the stomach to the liver. This region here is called the greater curvature that connects to the greater omentum, which connects the stomach to the large intestine. So as you can see here, the stomach is J-shaped. We call it J-shaped, and it starts at this region, and this sphincter is called the lower esophageal sphincter. Another name for this is called the cardioesophageal sphincter. And the reason we call that is because the heart sits right in this region. Sometimes gastric issues can be confused as a heart problem, and a heart issue can be confused as a gastric issue because the sphincter is located right underneath the heart. Some of the functions in the stomach include as a reservoir for this process of mixing the bolus of food with the gastric juices. So the purpose of that is to further break down the bolus of food so it can create a soupy liquid called chyme before it enters into the small intestine. Some of the digestive capabilities that occur are that we have the ability to digest proteins through pepsin and hydrochloric acid. We have the ability to, through gastric lipase, to break down triglycerides, and this is what is limited in adults, causing lactose intolerance. So the reservoir, holding reservoir of the stomach capability means that for about 2 or 4 hours, this bolus remains in the stomach as this digestive processes occur. There's a lot of mucus secreted by our stomach, gastric glands, and the mucus, the purpose of it is a protective purpose. So we want to protect the lumen of our stomach from the hydrochloric acid that is secreted in this area. There is some absorption that occurs in the stomach, very little. We have the ability to absorb water, electrolytes, aspirin, and alcohol. So if we look at this up-close image of the stomach mucosa, we can see these holes, and these holes are called gastric pits. So this is an image of what a gastric pit looks like and what is inside the gastric pit. So these gastric pits within the mucosa have 3 types of glands, or exocrine glands, that secrete their product into the stomach lumen. The first one are called the mucus neck cells. So they secrete mucus. They're secreting mucus, and the mucus is important as a protective covering along the stomach mucosa from some of these digestive enzymes, particularly the hydrochloric acid. So hydrochloric acid is secreted by our parietal cells, and the parietal cells secrete both hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. Hydrochloric acid is important for killing microbes and also assists in the breakdown of proteins. Intrinsic factor is important because it's needed for the absorption of vitamin B12. Chief cells secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase, which assist in protein digestion. The G cells here secrete a hormone called gastrin. Gastrin is important for stimulating the release of gastric juice. It also relaxes our sphincters, especially the esophageal sphincter, relaxes the ileocecal sphincter, and increase the motility of the stomach through the secretions of these hormones. So histologically, we talked about the submucosa, which is made up of areolar connective tissue and the 3 layers of muscle tissue, smooth muscle, which has a longitudinal layer, a circular layer, and an oblique layer, which assists in the contraction and relaxation of the muscle, churning the food, mixing the bolus with the gastric juices and the digestive enzymes. And then the outside is the serosa, which connects the stomach in the abdominal cavity. So the functions of the stomach include pretty much we want to mix this bolus with the gastric juices and the digestive enzymes to create a soupy liquid called chyme. So the breakdown of proteins begins in the stomach. Gastric lipase breaks down triglycerides. Then once the stomach is emptied, carbohydrates spend the least amount of time in the stomach, secondarily to high protein foods remain in the stomach longer, and the fat-laden moves contain the largest amount of triglycerides are going to be second to the carbohydrates. So first carbohydrates empty, the next would be fatty foods, and proteins remain in the stomach the longest. So eating a high protein diet may allow you to feel full for a long period of time versus eating a high carbohydrate diet. So let's move on to another accessory digestive organ, which is the pancreas. So the pancreas is located in the retroperitoneal region of our abdominal cavity. It lies posterior to the great curvature of the stomach. The secretions from the pancreas are going into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. So if we look at the anatomy of the pancreas, the head sits right along the curve of the duodenum. This is the body, and this is the tail. This is called the pancreatic duct. There's 2 methods of secretion. The pancreatic duct, you can see here, is bringing pancreatic juice, and it joins the common bile duct, which is bringing bile from the gallbladder and the liver into the into the hepatopancreatic ampulla. The hepatopancreatic ampulla, which is this space here, which is combining all this and bringing that into the duodenum. There's a second accessory duct that's called the duct of Santorini, which brings the pancreatic secretions into the empties about 2.5 centimeters above the hepatopancreatic ampulla. So we talked about in the past how the pancreas has both digestive and endocrine functions. 99% of the pancreatic glandular cells are exocrine cells or have digestive capabilities, and these are called Acini cells. These secrete pancreatic juice, you can see them here, into the pancreatic duct. So this pancreatic juice is made up of water, sodium bicarbonate, and enzymes. So this is needed because this is being dumped into the duodenum. And remember, the duodenum is receiving that first chyme from the stomach, and that is going to be a little acidic because it's coming out of the stomach. So this juice is slightly alkaline, which will help neutralize the chyme that's coming out of the stomach. Part of the pancreatic juice has digestive enzymes, which include pancreatic amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates. Other enzymes will break down proteins, and other enzymes like pancreatic lipase, which break down triglycerides. and other enzymes that digest RNA and DNA. Also, hormones are secreted, which stimulate the hormone secretin stimulates the release of this pancreatic juice. The second type of cells are called the pancreatic isolates, and they're endocrine cells, and they're only about 1% of this. And they secrete hormones that include glucagon, insulin, somatostatin, and they're primarily in the role of controlling our blood glucose, and that's part of our endocrine system. So let's look at the relationship between the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, and the duodenum. So this is the liver. There's the right lobe and the left lobe. There's the pancreas. You could see the head, the tail, and the body, the body and the tail. Here's the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. And remember, the stomach would be sitting right in this area. So the stomach has just, through the pyloric sphincter, moved chyme, which is that digestive bolus, into the duodenum. And in the duodenum, this chyme is somewhat acidic. So the pancreatic juice is going to be produced in the pancreas and secreted into the hepatopancreatic ampulla, which joins the ducts from the liver. So let's look here. We've got the right hepatic duct bringing the bile from the right side of the right liver, the right lobe of the liver, and we have the left hepatic duct bringing the bile that's produced in the liver from the left lobe of the liver. So these are going to join the common hepatic. When we don't use the bile that's produced in the liver, we store it in the gallbladder until it's needed. And then the gallbladder is going to secrete that bile into the cystic duct once there's food in this duodenum, and is going to join the common bile duct, which connects the gallbladder bile and the liver bile. And then this is going to connect to the pancreatic duct at the hepatopancreatic ampulla. So not only is it bringing the bile, but also the pancreatic juice into the small intestine, where in the small intestine, most absorption and digestion occurs. So let's talk about the liver. The liver is the heaviest gland in the body, only second to the skin. The liver is divided into two lobes, the right lobe and smaller left lobe. And part of that left lobe, and there's two smaller lobes. This one on top is called the caudate lobe, and this one on the bottom is called the quadrate lobe. That kind of looks like a square. We talked about this falciform ligament, which is a ligament that separates the right and left lobe and also suspends the liver from the anterior abdominal cavity. This little ligament down here is called the ligamentum teres, or the round ligament. It's a remnant of the umbilical vein. Up here, we can see the coronary ligament, which suspends the liver from the diaphragm. Connected to the liver, we can see the gallbladder, which we'll learn shortly is where bile is stored. It's made up of a neck, a body, and a fundus on the bottom. So let's look at the liver in more detail. Histologically, the liver is made up of a right and left lobe that is made up of functional unit called lobules. And you can see here the breakdown. And these lobules are hexagonal shape, you can see here. And let's talk about some of these details. So first of all, a hepatocyte is the major functional cell of the liver. And this primarily produces bile. So you can see the hepatocytes are these little structures here. They are lined up in a series of rows called hepatic lamellae. laminae. So this is hepatic laminae made up of these hepatocytes. So these hepatocytes, excuse me, they make bile and they're dumped into these bile canaliculi. So see these little green tubes, they're bile canaliculi. So when they produce this, the bile canaliculi is going to see, this is the arrow, bile is produced in the hepatocytes and it's going to be dumped into these bile ducts. Remember, we talked about how the bile ducts are going to unite the right and left side into the common hepatic duct, which joins the cystic duct, and then eventually into the common bile duct, which joins the bile produced in the gallbladder and in the liver, and then eventually dumps into the duodenum of the small intestine for digestion. At the same time that this is occurring in this direction, there's another flow of blood in the other direction. So this is a branch of the portal vein, which is bringing oxygen poor but nutrient rich blood from the gastric organs. And also it joins with a branch of the hepatic artery, which is bringing oxygenated blood from the abdominal aorta. This blood is going to mix and it's going to go through a series of what we call hepatic sinusoids. So hepatic sinusoids are highly permeable blood capillaries that receives both of these branches of vessels, and it's going to take the blood through a series of these sinusoids. And within the sinusoids, we have these cells called Kuffner cells, which are macrophages that cleanse this blood. They're eliminating old white blood cells, all red blood cells, bacteria, and any foreign matter before this blood is cleansed and filtered, and it goes into the central vein, which eventually will go into the hepatic vein, into the inferior vena cava. So let's look at this in more detail. So if we look at these hepatocytes in the hepatic laminae, you can see it's receiving the oxygenated blood from the hepatic artery and the poor oxygenated blood but nutrient rich from the portal vein. So this blood is going to enter the liver, and its purpose, it's going to eventually end up into the central vein, and this blood is going to be cleansed, filtered, and prepared before it goes into the central vein, eventually into the hepatic vein and to the inferior vena cava. So at the same time, these hepatocytes are producing bile, and the bile is going to enter into these hepatic canaliculi, going into the into the bile duct needed for the digestive process. So the thing I want you to note here, you see this little circle here, that's called the portal triad. So the portal triad includes the bile duct, the hepatic portal vein, and the hepatic artery. So the function of these hepatocytes, the primary function is bile production. And the purpose of bile in the digestive system is it emulsifies fat, meaning it breaks it down in pieces so it can eventually be further broken down and digested and reabsorbed. It processes blood-borne nutrients, stores fat-soluble vitamins, and also it detoxifies the blood as it's going through these sinusoids, Remember, and there's a lot of smooth endoplasmic reticulum and peroxisomes in this region, as well as the the macrophages that help in this process. So let's look at the portal circulation. Let's take a review. Here is our heart and the aorta, the abdominal aorta, and it's bringing the oxygen-rich blood via the hepatic artery into the liver. It's also through the aorta bringing oxygen-rich blood into our gastrointestinal organs, which includes the small intestine, stomach, pancreas, large intestine. So the deoxygenated blood from these organs are going to enter the hepatic portal vein, and they're going to be nutrient rich because they're absorbing the nutrients, especially from the small intestine, entering into the liver, as well as the hepatic artery, bringing that oxygen rich blood to the liver. The liver is producing bile that's exiting into the hepatic ducts, into the small intestine to assist in this digestive process. So let's look at this again. The oxygenated blood from the hepatic artery and the nutrient-rich blood, but it's deoxygenated coming into that hepatic portal vein. It goes through the hepatic sinusoids, where this blood is going to be cleansed, filtered. It's going to remove any kind of toxins. And that blood is going to enter into the central vein, into the hepatic artery, into the inferior vena cava, back into the right atrium of the heart, into the circulatory system. So we could see here, here's the heart. The abdominal aorta is bringing that oxygen-rich blood to our liver. The same time, through the abdominal aorta, it's going to feed all of these organs that are in our gastrointestinal system. So that blood's going to go through these organs, and it's going to bring through the veins back into the hepatic portal vein, bringing that deoxygenated blood, but nutrient-rich blood back into the liver for processing. All of this is going to be processed in the liver, into the hepatic veins, back into the inferior vena cava, into the circulation. So that's what we call the hepatic portal circulation. Some general functions of the liver include carbohydrate metabolism, liver metabolism. Carbohydrate metabolism is important in maintaining our normal blood glucose, the lipid metabolism, protein metabolism, breaking down proteins into amino acids that can be used for ATP production. It's going to process drugs and hormones. So in this region, we have a lot of smooth endoplasmic reticulum, peroxisomes that detoxify substances such as alcohol and medications that are taken. The excretion of bilirubin, which is derived from the breakdown of red blood cells. We synthesize bile salts. We store glycogen for further use, and vitamins that include vitamin A, B12, D, E, and K. Phagocytosis through these Kupfner cells, macrophages, which cleanse the blood as it is going through the hepatic sinusoids, and activation of vitamin D is important in our liver. So if we look at the gallbladder anatomically, here is the fundus, this is the body and the neck. The main function of the liver, the gallbladder, you have to know, is it stores bile. So that's the main function. It does not produce bile, but it stores bile until it's needed when we eat a lot of food. The bile is connected to the cystic duct. It releases the stored bile through the cystic duct, which joins the hepatic duct at the common bile duct. Then it will join the pancreatic duct and into the hepatopancreatic ampulla into the small intestine. the hormone cholecystokinin stimulates and releases the flow of blood into the bile into the duodenum. And as we talked about, bile is needed for the emulsification of fat or breaking it down and the absorption. So we move into the small intestine. So now this chyme is going into the small intestine, where these accessory digestive organs are also going to be secreted into the duodenum of the small intestine to further initiate digestion and absorption. The small intestine is made up of 3 regions. The shortest is the duodenum. The next region is the jejunum. And then the longest is the ileum. And the ileum connects to the first region of the large intestine via a sphincter or a little door called the ileocecal sphincter, which connects to the cecum of the large intestine, which is the first part of it. So if we look histologically at the small intestine, we notice its mucosa, or this layer, is made up of villi and microvilli. So these are folds that increase the surface area for digestion and absorption. The important thing about the small intestine is that almost all digestion and absorption of nutrients occur in the small intestine. You can also see a region here called the lamina propria. It contains veins, capillaries, and lymphatic vessels, with the lymphatic vessels are important for the absorption of fats. The goblet cells secrete mucus. The enteroendocrine cells secrete the hormones secretin and cholecystokinin, and the Paneth cells secrete lysosomes, which act as phagocytotic ability of that region of the small intestine. So as we talked about, that the small intestine is where most of the absorption and further digestion occurs, we have many layers that increase the surface area of the small intestine, beginning with these circular folds, which are made up of villi and microvilli. And within the microvilli, there's a region called brush borders that contain these digestive enzymes. The lamina propria, as you can see here, have the lymphoid malt tissue, which absorbs fats, and the submucosa has Berners glands, which secrete an alkaline mucus, which neutralize the gastric acid in chyme as it goes through the small intestine. So as we talked about, 99% of absorption and digestion are 99% of absorption occurs in the small intestine, and only 10% occur in the stomach and the large intestine. So segmentation occurs in the small intestine, and it's the method of how it's mixing the chyme with the digestive juices as it goes through the small intestine. There's peristalsis, which is the contracting and relaxation of the smooth muscles. So these brush border enzymes include carbohydrate digestive enzymes, protein digestive enzymes, which I've listed here, and nucleotide digestive enzymes, and secretes this intestinal fluid that is a very clear fluid that includes all of these digestive enzymes. So then we move on from the ileocecal valve into the large intestine. So the large intestine is only about 5 feet long. Let's talk about the different regions. This is the cecum. This is the ascending colon. This is the transverse colon. This is the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the rectum. So the ascending colon connects to the mesocolon. So via this ileocecal sphincter, it allows the chyme to enter the cecum of the large intestine. And on the cecum, you could see this little structure called the veriform appendix, which has lymphatic capabilities and sometimes can become inflamed and need to be surgically removed. So the movement of the chyme through the large intestine is through what we call haustral churning. So haustra are these little, kind of like these little tubes, and they contract and relax as the chyme is moving through the large intestine. An additional structure that helps with this are these longitudinal smooth muscles that contract and relax the haustra as the chyme is flowing through. You can see these omental appendages, which are adipose tissue, possible lymphatic capabilities. So this peristalsis occurs through the large intestine, and then eventually it's going to enter into the rectum. And this is the area where we feel that feeling that we have to defecate. And then the final stage occurs and pushes that undigested material and waste matter out the anus. So within the large intestine, most of the functions include the absorption of water. So we want to prepare this chyme for elimination. There's a little absorption of certain nutrients, but primarily we're reabsorbing water, preparing this mass for elimination. Mucus cells are going to release mucus. So this chyme also is going to be acted upon by what we call good bacteria that is going to break down any remaining carbohydrates. And often that's where we release a gas called flatulence. The bacteria in the gut is often what we call the good bacteria. And it decomposes bilirubin into a simpler pigment called stercobilin, which gives the feces a brown color. This whole process allows us to produce vitamin B and vitamin K that are absorbed into the colon. And then the feces reaches the rectum. And in the anal canal, we have two sphincters. There's an involuntary sphincter and a voluntary sphincter. So this voluntary sphincter is how we control holding our feces in until we go to the bathroom. So as you notice in infants, this external anal sphincter is not under our control, and that's why they can go and, defecate into their diapers as often as they do. So then the chyme can remain in the large intestine for about 3 to 10 hours, and it becomes like a semi-solid substance that we call feces. So as we can see, the functions of the large intestine are primarily absorbing a little bit of nutrients and lots of water. It produces certain vitamins, and it's forming the end result, which is called feces, and the elimination of feces. So the goblet cells mucus, and there are some microvilli which primarily are absorbing water. So discussing the circulation in the abdominal cavity, we learned that the abdominal aorta is bringing that oxygenated blood into the abdominal pelvic cavity. So if we look at this region in more detail, here's the abdominal aorta. We have a few unpaired vessels. The first one is called the celiac trunk. And the celiac trunk is going to provide the arteries that include the common hepatic artery going to the liver, bringing the oxygenated blood to the liver. gastric arteries bringing oxygenated blood to the stomach, splenic arteries, and pancreatic arteries. The next one that is unpaired is called the superior mesenteric artery. And pretty much the superior mesenteric artery is going to bring oxygenated blood to a lot of our small intestine, versus the inferior mesenteric artery is going to bring oxygenated blood to the large intestine. There's some unpaired arteries, which include the other paired arteries that come off the abdominal aorta include the renal arteries going to the kidneys, lumbar arteries with the supply of the posterior abdominal wall, and then the median sacral artery going to the pelvic organs. So here are the unpaired arteries, which include the celiac trunk, which is going to give off the common hepatic artery, gastric artery, and splenic arteries. Superior mesenteric artery, which pretty much is going to supply a lot of the small intestine, and the inferior mesenteric arteries giving oxygenated blood to the large intestine. Off of this too, we have other paired arteries, the suprarenal arteries, the renal arteries going to the kidneys, gonadal arteries, and it's going to the female, the ovaries or the testes, and then the median sacral artery, which would be located in this region. So when we divide the supply to the abdominal aorta, we divide it up into parietal branches, which will include the inferior phrenic artery going to the diaphragm. Here's the lumbar arteries. They're going to the posterior abdominal wall, and the median sacral artery going to the pelvis. The terminal branches of the abdominal aorta include the common iliac arteries. Then we've got the visceral paired branches of the abdominal aorta. It includes the suprarenal arteries going to the adrenal glands that are located on top of the kidneys, the renal arteries going to the kidneys, 20% of our cardiac outputs in this region. Then we've got the gonadal arteries. They're supplying the testes in the male and the ovaries in the female. Then we've got the visceral unpaired arteries, which receive about 25% of cardiac output at rest, which includes the celiac trunk, which has 3 branches to the gastric artery to the stomach, the splenic artery to the spleen, and the hepatic artery, which provides 20% of blood flow to the liver and also supplies the pancreas and the duodenum. The superior mesenteric artery pretty much supplies most of the small intestine and a little bit of the ascending colon, and the inferior mesenteric, which supplies the remaining portion of the large intestine. So the vein, remember the venous system is flowing in the opposite direction. It shares the similar names as our arteries, and that's bringing all that deoxygenated blood back into the inferior vena cava, back into the circulation. Okay, we are done. Have a good day.